The wind that morning carried more dust than warmth. It whispered along the empty rails of red willow, brushing against a woman who had nowhere left to stand. Her name was Clara Hensley, 29, dressed in her best blue wool dress, holding a letter that no longer meant a thing. The groom's family had taken one look at her and turned away. Too old, they said. Then the train took their son and her dreams down the tracks. The last echo of the whistle lingered like a wound. Boots scuffed the boards. The station master avoided her eyes. And for a long breath, Clara didn't move. Only the sound of her suitcase handle creaking in her hand. The kind of sound you remember when silence is all that's left. Somewhere beyond the dust, a man watched, not out of pity, but because he saw something familiar in her stillness. Something he'd carried for years on that lonely stretch of prairie. And that's where our story begins, with a woman sent back for being too old, and a rancher who decided maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he'd been waiting for. If these old Western stories stir something quiet inside you, stay a while longer and hit subscribe before we ride on into part 1, The Returned Bride. The whistle bled out into the cold like a thread of tin. Then, only wind. It slid under the warped boards of the red willow platform, found the nail heads, made them sing. Dust lifted and drifted, light as ash. Autumn light lay thin on the rails, a band of dull silver stretching north, then nowhere. She stood in that light without moving. A blue wool skirt brushed her boots. A small valise hung from her hand by a cracked leather handle. The handle creaked when the wind pushed. A soft, tired sound. The kind of sound a person hears even with eyes closed. A boy ran by with a sack of mail and didn't turn his head. 2 ranch hands at the freight wagon paused, then pretended not to stare. Farther down the platform, a woman's perfume rose and fell like a ribbon in the breeze. A man coughed, spit, went back to looking at nothing. A woman in a dark hat had been standing close earlier, all black feathers and rigid shoulders. She had leaned in with a glance sharp as a tack. Too old, she'd said, crisp as ice breaking in a glass. Then a gloved hand took the son by the elbow, turned him. The son didn't look back. Boots on pine boards. A step that said things were already decided. They boarded. The conductor waved. The bell clanged 2 quick notes. The long iron spine pulled away, dragging the town's breath after it. She kept her balance as the wake of the train rocked the platform. Her free hand found the seam at her skirt and smoothed it, the way one calms a frightened horse. The letter in her pocket cornered her hip. Stiff paper, folded, careful. The seal split days ago by a station lamp and a small knife. She hadn't read it again. There was no need. The words had already done what they were made to do. The sky had that white-hot edge it gets in late October, when the sun sits low but still tries to show its teeth. Cottonwoods along the creek had turned, their leaves like coins. They rattled and shivered, somewhere beyond the depot yard. A dog barked twice, stopped. A telegraph key clicked behind the ticket window, quick as a cricket. On the bench beside her stood a cardboard hat box with a smear of coal on its lid. Someone's Sunday hat under there, not hers. She set the valise on the bench and opened it 1 inch to let the air in. The smell of soap and cedar chips slipped out, mixed with coal smoke and cold metal. A dress folded with care, a comb wrapped in muslin, a ribbon, frayed at one end from too many tries at the same bow. On top, a thin city photograph curled at the corner, her in a studio chair, back straight, chin set. She closed the valise, snapped the brass latch, pressed her palm to it until the heartbeat in her hand matched the tiny shiver of the station. No one said her name. No one needed to. The town had a way of knowing before words did. Red Willow was like that, 2 stores facing one another across a strip of dirt. A smithy with a sudden orange mouth at dusk. A church whose bell tilted a few inches off true. 1 mile out, the land lay open, cut by a road that forgot itself after 3 miles and became 2 wagon ruts. 30 miles beyond that, mountains, blue and undecided. The station master's vest pin caught the light as he scratched in a ledger. He looked up once, then down again, his thumb pressing a line flat. There was caution in him, not unkindness. He pulled a cup from a shelf and filled it from the blue enamel kettle, left it on the sill within reach, didn't speak. The steam rose and dissolved. She saw it. She didn't reach. Her gloves were thin kid, stained along the fingers where ink had dried months ago. She turned one glove cuff and touched the stitching, small and tight, neat as rose in a winter garden. That touch steadied her. She drew in a slow breath, let it out. Another. A habit taught by train rides and long rooms where doors open and shut without her name ever said aloud. A wagon clattered by at the edge of the yard. The teamster's hat brim threw a shadow across his cheek. He clicked his tongue at the horses and they surged, iron shoes throwing up sparks when they struck a stone. The smell of hot leather and wood tar followed a few seconds after. A soft wake. "Ma'am," someone said behind her, a voice with the grain of the plains in it, not sharp, not soft. She didn't turn. The person didn't ask anything, didn't offer anything. The word hung there. Then the boots moved on, slow and steady, measuring distance like a carpenter's rule. Sound returned in pieces, the clink of couplers down the line, the paper breath of a notice tacked to a post, the far-off bray of a mule that disliked its load. In all of it, she found a kind of quiet, not peace, just a place for the heart to rest 1 inch. She lifted the valise. It had weight, but not much. 15 pounds. Maybe. The balance of it set her shoulder square. She took 3 steps to the edge of the platform and paused. The platform's last board stood rough and splintered, like a tooth broken off in a fight. A narrow gap showed the dirt below, churned and hard. Her boot toe nudged it once, testing. The wind took a lock of her hair and set it gently against her cheek, then let it go. The main street waited without invitation. Storefront glass dulled by dust. A painted sign that read, "Ward's Emporium." The W's leg, thin as a chicken bone. The hotel's porch sagging at one corner, its posts wearing bands of old rope like scars. A cookhouse sending up a thin ribbon of beef smoke. The smell made her mouth remember hunger. She did not move toward it. A small girl in a calico dress froze near the water pump, watching. A doll with a corn husk face rode her hip. The girl's eyes went to the blue dress, the valise, the steady mouth. She had likely heard the word on the platform, the word that had sent a whole family to the eastbound car, while a single woman stayed planted like a fence post. The girl's gaze was not cruel. It was curious in that old way children have when they look at something they know is important, but can't say why. The woman, Clara, though no one in town had used it yet, let her lips soften at the edges. The ghost of a smile not meant for anyone to notice. The girl blinked, lifted the pump handle with 2 hands. Water squealed up from the dark and spattered the trough. A gust shoved a sheet of reward notices against the depot wall. The paper flapped once, then settled. One face had gone almost blank from the sun. Another had eyes that still held ink-black fire. The numbers beneath them looked bold and sure. $50, $75. The world kept its accounts. She walked, down the step, onto the packed dirt, where wagon wheels had cut ribs that ran the length of the street. Her hem found dust and carried it like a secret. The valise tapped her knee each 3rd pace. She did not hurry. There was no place in Red Willow to hurry to. A room might be had at the boarding house for a night or 2, if one had coins and the landlady liked the look of a person. A woman alone carried a silence with her, a kind that set other silences humming. As she passed the blacksmith, a shower of sparks fanned out and stung the air. The smith lifted the iron from the fire, laid it on the anvil, and set the hammer to work. The ring of it walked down the street and back again. Metal telling its own truth, beat by beat. A bay gelding tied at the rail turned its head. The animal stretched toward her, nostrils flickering, reading the world on her breath. She held her palm out, steady. The horse touched it once, warm and careful, then went back to watching nothing in particular. Near the end of town, the creek cut a shallow V and slowed. Cottonwood leaves drifted on top, bright as coins until they sank and turned the color of tea. She stood on the plank bridge a long moment. The boards were slick where boots had worn them smooth. The water spoke that soft creek language made of small stones and thin current. It was not a thing to lean on. It was a thing to witness and leave. Back up the street a bit, the church door stood open, as if someone had stepped out and might be right back. A beeswax candle burned low in the side window, a tallow streak caught in its own heat. She did not go in. She did not avoid it. Some places are simply not yours yet. By the livery, a man in a brown coat leaned against the shade side of a post. Hat down, brim casting a piece of afternoon across his nose, boots dusty to the ankle. He did not shift when she passed. Only the smallest angle of his head changed, no more than a degree, enough to mark the moment, not to claim it. He had the stillness of a tree that had learned wind is a visitor, not an enemy. At the end of the plank walk, a stray glove lay face up, the fingers crooked as if it had been surprised. She reached for it by habit, then stopped. It wasn't hers. She folded it, placed it on the rail. The small act waited the day. A door across the street closed. A bell above it jingled once and went quiet. The town inhaled, held the breath. She went back to the depot when the sun slid an inch toward the ridgeline. Not far, just to the bench. The cup on the sill had gone cool. She lifted it then, tasted metal and old steam and something like kindness. 2 swallows, enough. She set it back where it had been. A touch more to the left, only she would notice. Evening started to gather itself from the corners. Shadows climbed the porch posts and wrapped them the way ivy would. If ivy grew here, the telegraph clicked again, then stopped, as if a hand somewhere far away had hesitated. She looked once more down the tracks. At the line the train had written in smoke that the wind was now erasing. There was a notion of a road beyond town, 2 ruts, a gate, a pasture that had gone to seed. Chances lived out there. Hard ground lived there, too. The choice would not be glamorous. It would be made in a small way. Boots on dust, a door, a nod. Her hand smoothed the skirt once more, not to perfect anything, just to feel the cloth under her palm and be sure of where she ended and the air began. Then she turned her head and, for the first time since the bell had rung, let her eyes meet the world straight on, not for a fight, not as surrender, only to mark the fact of herself, a horse stamped in the livery, a match struck in the hotel kitchen. The sound was small, but it threw a brief, bright flare on the glass. In that flash, there was the outline of a man's shoulder in the shade, no more than that. A presence at the edge, steady and undecorated, like a fence post set true. She picked up the valise. The handle creaked. She moved one step, then another. The boards took the weight, agreed to the bargain. Somewhere behind her, a pair of boot heels chose to keep time with that soft rhythm, not close, not far, not claiming, just there. And that was how it began. With wind through a crooked door, a cool cup set back on a sill, a glove folded for no one in particular, and the smallest shift in the air so slight a person might miss it, like the first cautious note a fiddle draws before the song knows its own name. The last light of day settled over Red Willow, like dust, finding a place to rest. The station quieted after the train left, just the sigh of the wind, a loose shutter knocking somewhere near the depot office. Clara had not moved far. Her valise sat beside her boots, edges stained with dust that had climbed from the earth itself. A figure watched from the far end of the platform, half shadowed by the freight wagon. Elias Boone, a rancher by title, though most in town knew him only as the man who kept to the high ridges with his sheep and his silence. He wasn't one for crowds, but the way the air around that woman stilled drew his eyes. He saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the kind that came when pride held a body together after the world had turned its back. The crowd had dispersed, taking their whispers with them. Only she and the wind remained, facing an emptiness bigger than any map could hold. Elias shifted his weight, the old boards creaking beneath him. His hand brushed against the worn leather strap of his satchel. He thought about walking away. But the image of her standing there alone, but unbroken, pulled at something deep, something he'd buried under seasons of work and silence. He took a step forward, then another. The sound of his boots on the wood reached her before his voice did. When he spoke, it was low, rough from disuse. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." She turned slowly. Her eyes were not the kind that pleaded. They measured, like someone used to counting what was left instead of what was lost. "If they don't need you," he added, eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat, "then I do." A faint furrow crossed her brow. "You want to hire me?" He shook his head. "No. Just want to give you a place to breathe." The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of coal smoke and dry grass. Clara looked past him toward the tracks, where the last shimmer of daylight still clung to the rails. She could have left, then walked toward town, vanished among doors that never truly opened, but she didn't. She nodded once. "A place to breathe," she said quietly, as if testing the shape of the words. He tipped his hat, not out of formality, but as a kind of understanding. Then he reached for the handle of her valise. The leather squeaked in protest, like it wasn't used to being held by anyone but her. They walked down the narrow dirt road together, the station fading behind them. The evening stretched long and copper-colored. Elias's horse waited at the hitching post, a roan mare with one ear nicked and the patience of something that had seen too many empty miles. He tied her valise behind the saddle, checked the cinch, and held out a hand. She hesitated, gloved fingers hovering just above his. It wasn't fear that slowed her. It was the unfamiliar weight of being helped. Then, almost imperceptibly, her hand met his. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. The contact lasted no more than a heartbeat, but it changed the air between them. She mounted, he followed. The horse snorted, hooves crunching against the gravel as they moved through the quiet street. Storefronts leaned into shadow. Lamplight flickered behind dusty windows. For a while, neither spoke. The rhythm of hooves on dirt filled the silence, slow and even, like the ticking of an old clock. Elias knew better than to break quiet that had meaning. Some silences healed faster when left alone. The road curved west, leading out of town. Sagebrush lined the ditches, brittle from the dry season. The air smelled of pine smoke from some far-off cabin. Overhead, the sky was turning to tarnished gold. After a long stretch, Clara spoke. "Why help me?" Elias kept his gaze ahead. "Wasn't help," he said. "Just didn't see a reason not to." She let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh, or might have been disbelief. Not many people do things without a reason. Maybe I'm not many people. That quiet humor, faint as it was, eased the last stiffness from her shoulders. The mare's ears flicked back, catching the sound of their voices as if it, too, was curious. They rode on, the prairie opening wider with every mile. Dusk gathered behind them like smoke from a dying fire. The world smelled of dry earth and cold sky. Clara's dress brushed the saddle leather in soft, rhythmic whispers. At the crest of a low hill, Elias reined in. From there, the land spread out like an old quilt, patches of wheat stubble, empty corrals, a line of cottonwoods guarding a creek bed. "Yours?" she asked. He nodded once. "What's left of it?" She followed his gaze, saw fences leaning under years of wind, roofs missing shingles, a single chimney breathing a faint wisp of smoke. It was both desolate and alive, the kind of place where solitude had settled deep, but hadn't won entirely. As they started down the hill, the sound of sheep bells drifted faintly through the air. A few animals dotted the slope, moving slow, shapes half swallowed by twilight. At the yard, Elias dismounted first. He untied her valise and set it gently on the porch. The boards there creaked like old men shifting in their sleep. "Inside's not much," he said, voice low, "but it's dry. You can rest." She studied him a moment before stepping down. The hem of her dress caught on a nail, tearing a thread. She freed it carefully, smoothing the fabric as if it mattered. When he opened the door, warm air drifted out, the faint smell of wood smoke and coffee long gone cold. The light from the small stove flickered across the floor, glancing off tools, books, a chair that had seen too many nights alone. He lit a lantern, set it on the table, and stepped aside. "You can stay here," he said simply. "There's a cot in the next room. I'll take the shed." She started to protest, but the quiet resolve in his voice told her it wasn't up for debate. For a moment, they just stood there. The man, the woman, and the small house that suddenly felt less empty. She ran her fingers along the edge of the table. Dust marked her glove. She didn't mind. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out soft, but sure. Elias nodded, then took his hat off and placed it by the door. The gesture carried more respect than any bow. He poured 2 tin cups of water from a pitcher, handed her one. The water was cool and metallic, tasting faintly of the well. They drank without speaking. Outside, the wind sighed against the walls, threading through the cracks as if it were listening. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called one long note, then silence. Clara glanced toward the window, where the night pressed close. "It's quiet here," she whispered. Elias looked into the firebox, watching a coal crack. "You'll get used to it." She wasn't sure she would, but she didn't say so. Instead, she set her cup down and untied the ribbon around her hat, placing it on the chair. The room felt warmer for it. He moved to the door, hesitated as his hand touched the frame. "You can leave whenever you want," he said. "Just don't let that train decide it for you." She didn't answer. But when he stepped outside and the latch clicked behind him, she stood there a long time, her hand resting on the table where his cup still sat. The lantern light trembled once, then steadied, and for the first time since the station, the air around her felt like it belonged to her again. Outside, the wind shifted soft, uncertain, like it was carrying something new across the wide, empty miles. The morning broke quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath. A low mist hung over the hills, softening the edges of everything: the fence posts, the empty corrals, even the roofline of the cabin that leaned slightly into the wind. Somewhere, far off, a single ewe bleated, the sound lost almost as soon as it began. Clara stood on the porch, her fingers curled around the worn railing. The wood was cold and smooth, shaped by years of use, by hands that worked before dawn and didn't stop till the light gave out. The air smelled of damp sage and ash from last night's fire. She could taste the distance in it, the kind that stretched not just over miles, but over years. Behind her, the house was still. She'd spent her first night in a small room at the back, where the walls met at odd angles and the floor tilted just enough to make a coin roll if you dropped it. A single quilt, thin and frayed at the edges, had covered her shoulders. She hadn't slept much. Every creak of the beams, every sigh of the wind, sounded like footsteps she couldn't name. Now, morning light spilled through the small square window, painting a thin stripe across the wooden floor, and right outside her door, there it was, a tin cup, still steaming, the smell of coffee, dark and familiar, cut through the chill. No note, no voice, just that small act. She knelt, wrapping both hands around the cup. It was warm enough to sting. She brought it to her lips slowly, closing her eyes as the heat found its way inward. It was the first kindness she'd tasted in months, maybe years. Through the open doorway, she caught sight of Elias in the distance. He was walking the fence line, his figure dark against the pale slope. The sheep pens behind him were mostly empty, gates left open, hay scattered in uneven piles. She'd heard the coughs of the flock in the night, and once, the soft crack of a rifle shot that told its own story. The sickness had taken more than animals, it had taken the will out of the air itself. He moved with the quiet precision of a man who knew the land wasn't his to command, only to tend, day after day. In silence, she watched him stop, check a post, tighten a wire, then move on. Not once did he look back toward the house. When he finally did return, the sun was high enough to burn off the mist. His coat carried the smell of lanolin and dust, and his boots left long prints in the dirt. "You sleep any?" he asked, voice low, like he was afraid to wake the land again. "Some, she said. Her voice sounded softer than she meant it to. Your place is quiet. Too quiet, he said, taking off his hat and setting it on the railing. You'll get used to it, or you won't. He poured water from the bucket by the step, splashed it over his hands, then rubbed them dry on the leg of his jeans. Got work if you want it, he said, not looking at her. Feed needs stacking, kitchen could use a sweep. She nodded. I'll find something to do. He gave a small grunt of agreement, then turned toward the barn. Inside, the air smelled of hay, iron, and time. Clara swept dust into neat piles, each one a small victory against neglect. She wiped the window pane clean with her sleeve, and real light spilled through for the first time in who knows how long. By noon, her back ached, and her hands were lined with the color of the floorboards. She didn't mind. There was something steadying about it work that expected nothing but effort, and gave quiet in return. When she stepped outside again, the sky had gone white with heat. Elias was at the trough, mending a broken plank. Sweat darkened the brim of his hat. She watched him a moment, then fetched the water pail, filled it, and set it near him without a word. He looked up just enough to meet her eyes. Appreciate it, he said. She nodded, but didn't smile. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was just there, like air that didn't need to move. Later, when the light turned amber, she stood on the porch again. Elias was still out, checking the fence. The land rolled away beneath the setting sun, endless and empty, but not cruel, just honest. She thought of the city she'd left, the noise, the hurried footsteps, the way people avoided each other's eyes. This silence was different. It asked nothing, but it didn't turn away either. A hawk circled above the ridge, its shadow slipping across the yard. The world was both vast and small in that moment. She felt the ache of something she couldn't name, maybe longing, maybe peace. When Elias came back, the last of the light clung to his shoulders. He set down his tools, washed again, and stood a long while looking toward the hills. Storm'll come before week's end, he said. She looked up at the pale sky. You can tell from that. He nodded, always can. Wind changes first. Then the smell. She inhaled, to her. The air still smelled like dust and pine, but she believed him. That night, as the house settled into darkness, she sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the wind scratch at the window pane. Her hands ached pleasantly from work. On the chair beside her lay her gloves, washed and hung to dry. A single thread had come loose, curling like a question mark. She thought of the coffee that morning, the heat, the quiet gesture of it. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone had given her in a long time. When she blew out the lantern, the dark filled the room completely. For a heartbeat, she thought she heard footsteps outside, soft, careful. Pausing near her door, then nothing. But when dawn came again, a new cup of coffee waited by the threshold, still warm, steam curling like breath in the cold. No note, no word, just that same small kindness, waiting in silence. The days began to fall into a kind of rhythm, slow and unspoken. Mornings came gray and quiet, the fog curling around the porch rails before the sun burned it away. By then, Elias was already gone, boots on the trail, coat dark with dew, a long shape moving steady through the fields. The gate would creak once behind him, then close itself. That sound, soft and certain, told Clara when the day had truly started. Inside the cabin, the air still held the faint smell of last night's fire, wood smoke and iron, a trace of coffee. She would light the stove again, stir the ashes until the coals flared, then set the kettle on. Her hands moved without thought now, each motion learned from the small necessities of living, folding, sweeping, mending, tending. It was work that left no proof except a cleaner table and the quiet pride of order. When she washed clothes at the pump, her reflection wavered on the surface of the tin basin, older, perhaps, than she remembered, but steadier too. The cold water bit into her fingers, reddened the skin, numbed it until she forgot about the sting. That's when it happened, the slip of the knife's edge while she scraped mud from a boot heel. a small cut, barely worth notice. Yet it bled enough to remind her that even silence had teeth. She wrapped her hand in a strip torn from her petticoat, went on with her work. By dusk, the bleeding had stopped, though her palm throbbed with a dull pulse that matched the sound of the wind against the walls. Elias returned after sundown, dust on his coat, the smell of sheep and cold air following him in. He nodded once at her before setting his tools by the door. They didn't talk much that evening. The meal was simple beans, bread, and the quiet scrape of tin spoons. When she rose to clear the table, he said softly, "You hurt yourself." She paused. "It's nothing." His gaze flicked to the cloth wrapped around her hand. He didn't argue, only nodded, the kind of nod that meant he'd seen it but would leave it be. The fire cracked between them, sparks rising and fading before they reached the chimney mouth. That night, she dreamt of running water of a river she couldn't cross, wide and cold, the sound of it like wind through hollow wood. Morning came pale and slow. The first thing she saw when she opened the door was steam rising from a cup on the step. The second was the square of rough fabric folded beside it, corners stitched in careful lines. A handkerchief, coarse but strong, the thread the color of winter straw. She turned it over in her fingers. The stitches weren't pretty, but they were precise, each one holding the next like a promise not to come undone. No note, no sign of when he'd left it there. Only the faint warmth of a cup that hadn't been long from a man's hand. She pressed the cloth to her palm. It fit. That day. The wind carried the scent of rain, though the sky stayed clear. Elias worked near the far pasture, hammering new planks where the fence had given way. Clara could see him from the porch, a single dark shape moving against the wide gold of the land. She went about her chores, but her eyes kept finding that same silhouette, steady and alone. At noon, she walked to the creek to rinse the morning's wash. The water there ran slow, whispering over the stones. She lifted the hem of her dress, knelt, and let her fingers trail through the current. The bandage was gone, replaced by his handkerchief, the fabric already damp from the work. She smiled, barely, the kind of smile meant only for herself. When she returned, he was by the barn, stacking feed. His shirt sleeves were rolled, forearms streaked with dust and sun. He saw her coming, but didn't speak. She nodded once, set the basket by the steps. He tipped his hat in reply, then went back to his work. There was no need for words. The air between them had learned a new language, small gestures, shared quiet, the rhythm of two lives brushing edges without colliding. That evening, she cooked stew with the last of the carrots from the root cellar. He washed up outside, the sound of water in the basin slow and steady. When he came in, the light was fading, the smell of rain stronger now. He sat across from her, spooned the food without comment. Halfway through the meal, he reached for the salt, and his hand brushed hers. It wasn't deliberate, just the natural reach across a narrow table. Still, the touch lingered. Her breath caught for an instant, then steadied. He didn't pull away. Outside, thunder murmured far off in the hills. They finished eating, and she gathered the bowls, moving slower than usual. When she turned, he was still watching the window, eyes tracking the distant flash of lightning. His voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "Storm's coming sooner than I thought." She nodded, setting the dishes aside. "You were right about the wind changing." He smiled barely there, more in his eyes than his mouth. "It always tells you first, if you listen." She looked down at her hands, at the faint line where the cut had closed, then at the rough cloth now folded neat beside the stove. "I'm learning," she said quietly. The rain arrived in small, uncertain drops, tapping the roof like fingertips. They stayed that way for a while, him by the window, her by the stove, each listening to the other's silence. When he finally rose to check the doors, she caught herself watching the way he moved, unhurried but sure, as if each motion was a part of some old pattern the world had forgotten. He hung his hat on the peg, turned to her. "You'll hear the wind through the chimney tonight," he said. "Don't let it bother you." "I won't," she replied. He nodded once, then stepped into the dark hall that led to his room. She listened to his boots on the floorboards, the quiet click of the latch. The rain deepened, soft but steady, washing the dust from the air. Clara sat at the table, tracing the stitching on the handkerchief with one finger, following each line like a trail that led nowhere but still mattered. After a while, she rose, blew out the lamp, and went to her room. She set the handkerchief on the small table beside her bed. In the dark, it was just a square of fabric, but to her, it felt like something else, something unspoken, patient, waiting for its own name. And when the wind came through the chimney, it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like breath shared between two people learning, without a word, how to listen. Late afternoon draped the hills in gold, the kind of gold that doesn't shine, only hums softly against the earth before slipping away. Clara sat on the porch steps, the light touching her shoulder, her skirts gathered neatly at her side. The boards beneath her were warm from the day's sun, the air heavy with the smell of sheep and sage. A sheet of paper trembled in her hand as she wrote, the ink bleeding just slightly at the edges where her pen paused too long. The porch was quiet except for the slow creak of wood and the wind brushing the grass. She wrote in careful strokes, the way one speaks to someone they have not seen in a lifetime. The words came haltingly, then they came faster. "Dear Nathan," she whispered under her breath, shaping the name like a prayer. Elias stood a little ways off, near the fence line, fixing a hinge that hadn't sat right since spring. He looked up once and saw her bent over the paper, sunlight catching the copper of her hair. For a moment, he thought she was praying. Then he saw the motion of her pen, the slow rise and fall of her shoulder. The letter. He hesitated, then set his hammer down. The sound of metal against wood was soft, but she still heard it, her hand stilled. "You still writing to him?" His voice came quiet, not accusing, only curious like a man testing the air before he spoke again. She turned slightly, enough that he could see her face in profile. Her eyes stayed on the page. "Sometimes," she said. Elias nodded, hands finding his pockets. "You mail them?" "No." She folded the paper once, then again. "There's nowhere left to send them." He waited. The silence stretched. Then she spoke again, her voice lower. "Nathan was my fiancé. He went to war in '63, didn't come back." The wind shifted, and the smell of rain carried through the dry air. Elias leaned against the post, thumb brushing a groove in the wood. "War takes more than men," he said quietly. "Sometimes it keeps what's left of them, too." Clara didn't answer. She just stared at the folded paper in her hand. The edge of it had bent slightly where her fingers pressed too hard. She smoothed it out, the motion almost tender. When she finally looked up, Elias was already walking away toward the barn, his steps slow but sure. The sun caught his figure for a moment before the shadows swallowed him whole. That night, the wind picked up. It rattled the eaves and whispered through the chimney flue. Clara sat by the small table in her room, the lamp throwing an amber circle across the walls. Before her lay a wooden box, worn at the edges, its brass latch dulled with time. Inside were letters, some sealed, some folded and creased so many times they had begun to tear along the folds. She traced the edge of one envelope with her finger. The handwriting on the front had grown faded, but she didn't need to read it. She knew every word by heart. She lifted the lid a little higher, as though the air inside the box might still hold the sound of his voice. Then she closed it again. Her hand lingered there, palm flat against the wood. The room smelled faintly of soap and smoke. Outside, thunder muttered beyond the ridge. She didn't see him pass by her window, but she heard the quiet rhythm of his boots on the dirt, slow, purposeful, from her chair. She watched through the thin curtain as he crossed the yard, a shovel balanced over his shoulder. He moved toward the far edge of the pasture, near the old sheep pen. Lightning flickered far off, just enough to make out the shape of him bending to the ground. The steady scrape of metal meeting earth reached her through the glass. She rose, drawn by something she didn't fully understand, and went to the window. Elias was digging a small hole, shallow, careful. The rain began to fall, thin and steady, dotting the dust around his boots. He paused, looked toward the house once, then back to the earth. When he straightened, he held the wooden box. For a heartbeat, she thought he might be burying something of his own. Then she saw her letters, the same box she had left by her window hours earlier. He set it down gently in the hollow he'd made, his hands lingering a moment on the lid. Then he pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket, folded it once, and placed it atop the box before covering it with dirt. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone saying grace without words. The rain fell harder, flattening the ground. She watched as the last trace of the hole disappeared beneath his hands. When he was done, he stood there for a long moment, hat in hand, rain running down his face. Then he turned back toward the house, his shoulders dark against the glow of the window. Clara stepped away before he could see her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly. Part of her wanted to be angry to demand why, how he'd touched something that wasn't his. But beneath the sting was something else, a strange lightness. She looked down at her palms. The ink from earlier had left a faint mark on her skin. She rubbed it with her thumb, watching it fade. Outside, the door opened and closed softly. Footsteps crossed the floorboards, then stopped in the hall. She waited, breath held. There was no knock, no voice, only the faint slide of paper under her door. She hesitated, then reached for it. The note was small, written in the same plain hand she'd seen on the feed ledger. Don't write anymore. Live instead. The words were simple, almost clumsy, but something in them made her chest ache. She folded the paper carefully, like it might break, then placed it beside the lamp. The rain went on all night, whispering against the roof, filling the air with that clean, hollow sound the land made when it was finally letting go. When morning came, the clouds still hung low over the hills. The sheep stirred in the pens, restless after the storm. Clara stepped outside, her hair damp with mist, her eyes drawn toward the field where he'd worked. There was no sign of what he'd done, just the dark patch of soil where the rain had smoothed everything flat. She stood there a long while, the wind tugging at her skirt, the smell of wet earth thick in the air. Then, quietly, she said it aloud, not as a vow, not as surrender, but as truth. All right. And when she turned back toward the house, the world felt a little wider, as if something long buried in her had finally been set free. The first snow had not yet come, but the air already held its promise. The nights grew longer, the wind more restless, and the land, once green and forgiving, turned brittle beneath its own weight. Clara felt it most in the mornings, how the light seemed slower to rise, how the kettle took longer to boil. Even the sheep were quiet. Only the whisper of the grass and the creak of the house kept her company. Then came the whispers from Red Willow. They didn't travel by horse or post, but through voices carried on the windriders stopping for feed, women at the store, a letter dropped by mistake. That mail-order bride, they said, the one who got sent back. The words changed with every tongue, but the end was always the same. She's living with Elias Boone now. The words reached her before Elias ever heard them. She caught them in the way people's eyes lingered too long when she rode into town, in the pause before someone answered her greeting. And she bore it the way one bears a stone in a shoe quietly, knowing no one else could take it out for her. Elias seemed untouched by it all. He worked as he always had, his silence steady, his eyes set on the horizon. If he noticed the way the storekeeper's wife whispered behind her ledger, or how a neighbor's greeting carried a shadow of pity, he didn't show it. He simply hitched his supplies, nodded to the man behind the counter, and left town with the same unbothered stride. But for Clara, each look, each hush, pressed deeper. She had survived loss, hunger. The long ache of loneliness, but shame, was a colder wind. It crept into her bones when she wasn't watching. That was when Mrs. Abigail Monroe came. Her arrival was heralded by the sharp rhythm of carriage wheels on gravel and the scent of lilac powder that didn't belong to this land. She stepped down in a dark coat trimmed with fur, her hat wide, her voice honeyed but precise. She was the richest widow in the territory. Her husband's cattle brand spread over 100 miles of pasture. People said she had charm enough to stop a clock and the money to make it start again. Clara met her at the porch. Elias was mending a harness by the barn, unaware or pretending to be. Mrs. Monroe smiled a polished kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "My dear," she said, looking Clara over as if measuring the distance between them. "You must be Miss Hensley." "Clara," she said softly. "Clara," the woman repeated, letting the name linger. "I've heard so much about you." There was a pause, the kind that had weight to it. Then, with a gentle sigh, the widow turned toward the barn. "And Mr. Boone, of course. Such a man of solitude. It's been far too long since anyone's seen him off this ridge." Elias looked up, his hands stilling on the leather strap. "Afternoon, ma'am?" She approached with that careful grace only the well-bred carry, stopping just close enough for the wind to catch her perfume. "I'm hosting a gathering next week," she said, "a harvest supper of sorts. I'd be honored if you'd both attend. There'll be music, conversation, perhaps a bit of warmth before the snow comes." Elias wiped his hands on his jeans. "I appreciate the thought. It's more than a thought. Mr. Boone," she said, smiling faintly. "It's an invitation. I'm sure folks in Red Willow would be glad to see you among them again." He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "All right." The woman's smile deepened. "Splendid." She turned to Clara, her eyes flicking down to the frayed edge of her apron. "You must come too, my dear. It'll be good for you both." Clara gave a small nod, though her voice caught somewhere in her throat. "Thank you, Mrs." Monroe left in a cloud of dust and perfume, her carriage vanishing down the road like a dark thought carried away by the wind. That evening, Clara worked quietly in the kitchen. The stew simmered, the lamplight trembled against the window pane. Elias came in late, his boots leaving a trail of dry earth on the floor. "She means well," he said finally, as if reading her silence. "Does she?" Clara's tone was gentle, but the question stayed in the air between them. Elias looked at her, then at the fire. "People will talk. Clara, no matter what we do." She stirred the stew once, slowly. "Yes," she said, "they will." Neither spoke after that. The quiet grew thick, filling the room until even the ticking of the clock seemed too loud. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house felt smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer. She lay there until the first hint of dawn pressed against the window. Then she rose. Her movements were soft, deliberate. She folded her dress, packed her shawl, tucked a few coins into the pocket of her skirt. The rest she left as it was. The only thing she hesitated over was the handkerchief, the rough one, with the careful stitches, folded neatly atop the dresser. She touched it, tracing each seam with her finger. For a moment, she thought of taking it with her. Then she set it down. Outside, the world was gray and still. The stars were fading, and the horizon held a thin line of light. Her breath came out in small clouds. She moved quietly through the yard, boots leaving shallow prints in the frost. When she reached the edge of the fence, she turned once, looking back. The cabin was dark, the smokehouse, the barn, the hills all sleeping under the same stretch of sky. Somewhere inside, she knew. The coffee pot was ready to be set on the stove, the same way it was every morning. She left without a sound. The wind rose behind her, brushing the porch rails, lifting the handkerchief just enough that it slipped from the dresser, floated down, and landed near the door. It lay there, half in shadow, half in the pale light of dawn, waiting for someone to find it, or maybe just to rest where it was. By the time the first sunbeam reached the porch, Clara was already gone from sight. Only the faint echo of her steps lingered, carried by the wind toward the town that would speak her name again before noon. And back at the cabin, Elias Boone woke to the silence she'd left behind, a silence sharper than any storm that had ever crossed those hills. The wind had a strange taste that morning, dry, sharp, restless. It carried the smell of something waiting to happen. By midday, the sun hung low and coppery, and the whole sky shimmered as though the earth were holding its breath. Elias Boone worked alone on the ridge, patching the roof of the lambing shed. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt, and his hands moved steady, unhurried. The season had turned cruelly dry, grass cracked underfoot, and even the sheep moved without sound, their hooves stirring up a fine, bitter dust. Down in the valley, the horizon rippled heat waves, maybe something more. By the time he smelled the smoke, it was already too late. A low crack, then another. He turned, eyes narrowing toward the west. A black column rose beyond the ridge, slow at first, then billowing upward with a sudden roar. The wind caught it, twisting it into a long, angry shape that climbed straight into the sky. "God help me," he muttered. Then he ran. He didn't think about the barn or the tools, only the flock. They were penned near the lower slope, close to where the fire was crawling fast through the brush. He grabbed a wet burlap sack from the trough, threw it over his shoulder, and drove his boots into the ground until each step sounded like thunder. The world changed color. Smoke turned the air a bruised gray, and sparks rode the wind like wasps. He shouted at the sheep, waving his arms, coughing hard as he tried to push them toward the open gate. Some scattered, some froze, their eyes rolling white with panic. He swung the sack, swatting at the embers falling around him. Then the sound came a split, deep and sharp. The roof beam above the pen shuddered once, then gave way. He barely had time to dive. The crash shook the earth, and the world became fire and noise and blackness. For a moment, he didn't know which way was up. The air was thick enough to choke. His shoulder burned. The smell of his own hair, singed and bitter, filled his nose. He tried to crawl, but the debris pinned him halfway down. The sheep had fled. Only the crackle of flame answered his breath. He coughed again, harder this time, his body fighting for air. And then, through the roaring, he heard something else. A horse, hooves pounding hard against the ground. Closer, closer, until they stopped just beyond the smoke. Then a voice hoarse, but clear. Elias. He thought it was his mind playing tricks. He blinked through the haze, eyes burning. But when the smoke shifted, he saw her Clara, dismounting, her skirts whipping around her legs, one hand over her mouth. "Get back," he shouted, or tried to, but the sound came out broken. She didn't listen. She never did when it mattered. Clara pulled her shawl around her face and moved toward the flames, crouching low. The heat hit her like a wave, the kind that sears everything it touches. She found him half buried under a beam, the skin on his temple blackened, his breath ragged. "Can you move?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady enough to work. He shook his head once, coughing. "Leave it," he gasped. "Go?" She ignored him. She tore at the beam with her bare hands, the rough wood splintering under her palms. Sparks bit at her arms. Her lungs screamed for air, but she didn't stop. "Damn it! Clara!" he managed, his words fading. She braced her shoulder against the beam, pushing with all she had. It groaned, shifted, then rolled enough for him to crawl free. Together, they stumbled out, half blind, her arm under his weight heavy against her side. The world around them was nothing but smoke and heat and the wild, beating sound of the fire. By the time they reached the open field, her hair was streaked with ash. His shirt clung to his back in tatters. They collapsed in the grass, coughing, gasping for breath. For a long time, neither spoke. When the fire finally began to die, the wind shifted. Smoke rose in tired curls, drifting east. The pasture lay black and broken, the barn nothing more than a skeleton of charred beams. Clara lay on her back, staring at the clouds returning to the sky. Her chest still heaved with the rhythm of fear and relief. Beside her, Elias coughed once, tried to sit up. Failed. She turned to him. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes half closed. "You should have let me burn," he muttered. Her voice came quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the smoke. "Don't say that." He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "You left. I know. Why come back?" She looked at him then, really looked the man who had given her a roof, a silence she could breathe in, and the smallest kindnesses she hadn't known how to receive, the man she'd run from because of words whispered by others. The wind caught her hair again, carrying the smell of burned cedar. She reached for his hand, rough, blackened, trembling. "I don't know how to leave anyone behind anymore," she said softly. Her thumb brushed the soot from his knuckles. His fingers twitched, then closed around hers. The sun sank lower, painting the smoke with red. The land around them was ruined, yet alive the faint bleating of a few surviving sheep carried from somewhere beyond the ridge. For a long while, they sat in that stillness, broken only by the sound of crackling timber cooling in the air. When darkness came, Clara rose and walked to the ruins. She found a length of unburned wood and pressed it into the soil, a marker. Nothing more. Then she returned to him, knelt beside him again. "Can you stand?" she asked. "Maybe." He tried, and she steadied him, her arm firm under his. Together, they began the slow walk back toward what was left of the house. Every step was a promise neither of them dared to speak. The fire behind them hissed as it met the night dew, the last of its anger dying into steam. Above the ridge, the stars began to show again, faint but unbroken. Elias stopped once, looking back over his shoulder at the blackened field. His voice came low, barely more than breath, lost near everything. Clara turned toward the horizon, where the smoke was thinning. "Not everything," she said. He looked at her then, and in the dim light, something changed, something small, but enough to make the space between them feel whole again. When they reached the porch, the steps creaked under their weight. She eased him into the chair by the door. He sat there, head bowed, breathing shallowly. Inside, the kettle still stood on the stove, untouched since morning. Clara filled it, struck a match, and watched the flame catch. The small fire hissed to life, trembling in the dark. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And outside, on the hill where the embers still smoked, the wind shifted once more soft this time, almost kind as though the land itself exhaled. The wind outside had gone quiet. The way it does after a storm has taken everything it wants. Smoke still clung to the air, faint but stubborn, drifting from what remained of the barn. Inside, the house was dim, except for the glow of the hearth, a low, steady flame that threw its warmth toward the bed. Elias Boone lay there, one shoulder bound in white cloth, his chest rising slow under the weight of sleep and pain. His skin still carried the shadow of soot, and his hands bore the color of fire that had tried and failed to keep him. Clara sat beside him, her hair pulled back, her palms rough with salve and ash. The room smelled of herbs and burnt wool, and something else, something like relief she was too tired to name. Each time he stirred, she wet the cloth and pressed it gently against his forehead. He'd been awake once or twice through the night, long enough to murmur her name and drift back into dreams where smoke still followed him. Now, in the hush of morning, she sat still, watching the line of light creep slowly across the floor. It stopped at his boots by the door, the leather scorched and cracked. He groaned softly, eyes fluttering open. The sound broke the quiet like a crack in thin ice. "You're awake," she said. "Could have fooled me," he rasped, voice dry as sand. She smiled despite herself. "You almost didn't make it?" He turned his head slightly, wincing. "You should have left me there." "I tried that once," she said. "Didn't suit me." His gaze found her then, sharper than before. He saw the burn on her sleeve, the red line across her wrist where fire had kissed her too close. His jaw tightened. "You got hurt. Just a mark," she said. "It'll fade." They let the silence fill the room again, both staring at the small fire in the hearth. Its light flickered across the wall, painting them in amber and shadow. After a while, he said, "You shouldn't have come back." "Clara." She didn't answer. She just wrung out the cloth, water dripping into the bowl like the ticking of an unseen clock. He turned his face toward the ceiling. Sick flock, empty fields, half a roof gone, man like me. I don't have much left worth saving. Her voice was quiet but steady. That didn't stop you from running into the fire. That was different. How? He hesitated, the words dragging through him like gravel. Those sheep needed me, and you think no one else does. The question landed like the fall of a single drop in a dry well. He didn't answer. Clara leaned back in the chair, her eyes still on the flames. You talk like a man who's already decided the world doesn't want him, but maybe the truth is simpler. He looked at her, brow furrowing. Maybe, she said softly, you've never given anyone a reason to stay. The words lingered between them, sharp and bare. Elias's breath caught once, then steadied. He didn't look away. You think that's how it works? He asked after a long moment. She nodded faintly. I think people stay for what they're allowed to see. And you, she paused, finding her words you hide everything worth knowing. For a time, the only sound was the low pop of the logs. Then Elias sighed. You've got a way of making a man feel like he's being forgiven and scolded at the same time. She smiled again, small and weary. Maybe that's the only way people learn. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a wince. She reached forward, resting her hand lightly on his arm to steady him. The touch was soft, almost hesitant, but it stayed. The firelight caught on the edge of her sleeve, and the color there seemed to warm everything it touched. Elias didn't move. He just looked at her hand, then at her face. The years of loneliness in him rose like smoke. But for once, they didn't choke the air, they thinned, leaving something almost clear. He said quietly, I don't remember the last time someone sat beside me without needing something. Then remember this, she said. Her hand lingered on his arm, the gesture neither bold nor shy, just human. The kind of thing two people might share when words had finally run out of use. Outside, a cold gust rattled the shutters, reminding them both how thin the walls were, but the warmth inside held its ground. She rose to tend the fire, adding a new log. Sparks drifted upward, catching briefly before falling. Behind her, Elias said, I thought dying would be easy. Thought I'd earned the right not to be missed. She turned, the orange glow tracing her face. You were wrong. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing there, something neither of them would dare to name yet. When she sat again, their hands found each other without intention, her fingers rough from work, his bandaged and trembling. For a long time, neither moved. The fire burned low, humming like an old lullaby. Outside, the land still smelled of smoke, but in here, there was only the faint scent of pine and breath. He closed his eyes, his voice fading softer than the crackle of the coals. Feels like I owe you more than I can ever say. You don't owe me anything, she said. Just live. The words were simple, the same ones he'd once written to her on a scrap of paper. This time, they sounded like a promise returned. The flame dipped, then caught again, rising steady in gold. She watched it a while longer, until the room turned gentle with the hush of healing. When she finally stood to draw the curtain against the wind, Elias had already drifted back to sleep, his face turned toward the light. Clara looked at him once, then back at the fire. The coals pulsed slow and deep, the color of heart blood. And though the world outside still waited in ruin, something in that room had already begun to rebuild itself quietly, patiently, the way all true things do after the burning is done. Snow had begun to fall on Red Willow by the time Clara reached the station. The flakes were small, thin, the kind that drift sideways in the wind before settling into silence. The platform boards creaked beneath her boots, dusted white along the edges. It was the same station where months ago her world had come undone, and standing there again felt like walking through an old dream she wasn't meant to revisit. The sky was the color of tin. The train whistle echoed down the line, a long, lonely sound that reached into her chest and stayed there. She held the ticket between her gloves, the paper soft from the heat of her hands. Chicago. She wasn't sure what waited for her there, only that it wasn't this place. Behind her, people moved about in their own quiet ways. A mother hushing a crying child, two ranch hands talking low, steam rising from their breath. Somewhere, someone laughed. The sound cut through the cold like a flicker of light. Clara turned her face away from it, her eyes fixed on the tracks. The fire had taken most of the barn, half the sheep, and all that Elias had built over the years. She'd stayed as long as she could after that night, long enough to see him heal enough to walk again, long enough to realize he might never ask her to stay. So, she'd packed her things one more time, this time with no anger, only a quiet knowing. The whistle blew again. Closer now. She could see the plume of smoke stretching over the hills, the train pulling its shadow behind it. She straightened her coat, tucking a loose strand of hair under her scarf. A hand brushed her shoulder. Clara. She turned. Elias stood a few steps away, his breath coming in visible clouds. The sling was still across his shoulder, his coat pulled tight against the cold. His face was pale but steady, the kind of steadiness that comes when a man's decided not to run anymore. "You shouldn't be out here," she said softly. "I've been out here before," he replied, his voice rough but calm. "The world doesn't change much." He took another step, then stopped, the sound of his boots crunching in the snow. "Where you headed east?" she said. "Maybe St. Louis first, maybe farther." He nodded, looking past her toward the train now rolling into view, steel wheels hissing on frozen track. "You always did talk like the land was something to outrun." She smiled faintly, her eyes on the ground. "It's not the land I'm running from." The crowd began to stir as the train slowed, voices rising with the hiss of steam. The doors opened, and for a moment, Clara thought that would be the end of it, just the two of them, standing in the same wind, pretending the distance wasn't already written between them. Then Elias stepped closer. "I heard what folks have been saying," he began, "the things they whispered in town." She shook her head. "Let them talk." "I used to think that way," he said. "Thought if I kept quiet long enough, the world would forget. But it never does. It just keeps making up its own story." Clara looked up at him then, her eyes soft and searching. He swallowed once, as if steadying himself. Then he raised his voice louder than she'd ever heard it, enough to turn the heads of the people around them. "You called her too old," he said, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Said no man would keep her. Said she was sent back." The crowd went still. Elias took another step forward, his boots heavy on the boards. "But that woman," his voice cracked, then found its strength again. "She's the one who pulled me out of a burning barn. She's the reason there's still a roof over my head and breath in my chest." He paused, the wind tugging at his coat. "So, if none of you want her," he said quietly, the words carrying in the hush that followed, "then let me." The sound that came after wasn't loud, just a murmur at first, then a wave, a soft applause that built until it filled the station. A few hats tipped. Someone called his name. Clara stood frozen, the ticket trembling in her hand. Her throat felt too tight to breathe. Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice again so only she could hear. "I can't promise you much. The barn's gone, half the flock too. But I'll rebuild, if you'll be there to see it." The train's whistle pierced the air one last time. Steam curled around them, blurring the world into white and gray. Clara looked at the ticket, at the place where her fingers had worn the corner soft. She could have stepped onto that train, left the whispers and the hurt behind, started clean. But clean wasn't the same as whole. She let the paper slip from her hand. The wind caught it, carried it down the platform until it disappeared beneath the wheels. When she looked back, Elias was waiting, not smiling, not pleading, just waiting. She took one step toward him, then another, and when her hand found his, it was as if the cold forgot how to touch her. The applause faded, the train pulled away, and the platform emptied slowly until only the two of them remained. Elias turned her hand over in his, rough thumb brushing her wrist. "You sure?" he asked, barely above a whisper. She nodded. "I've been sure since the fire." The wind eased for a moment, as if the land itself had gone still. He lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture so simple it felt older than either of them. Then, together. They turned toward the road leading home, the long stretch of earth that had burned, and still, somehow, waited for them. Behind them, the whistle echoed one last time before fading into the hills. And in the quiet that followed, even the cold seemed to soften, as if mercy itself had found a place to rest. Spring came slow to the hills that year, creeping in like a guest unsure if it was welcome. The earth, blackened from the fire, began to green again, first in the hollows where the frost broke early. Then, along the ridge where the sheep wandered, the air held the raw, sweet scent of new life rising out of what had been lost. Clara and Elias worked side by side, though neither called it that. To them, it was just the day 1 hour following the next, the sound of nails meeting wood, the hum of wind through grass that hadn't grown here in months. The old barn stood again, smaller this time but sturdy, smelling of pine and sweat. Elias's shoulder still ached when he lifted too high, so she learned to brace the boards while he hammered. Their shadows moved together across the dirt, one taller, one slender, the rhythm of their labor falling into a quiet harmony. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low, they would sit on the porch steps, boots dusted white, hands too tired for words. He'd roll a cigarette and not light it, and she'd lean her elbows on her knees, watching the last of the light slide down the valley. There was peace in that silence, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. By early summer, the field had softened again. Grass thickened between the stones, and the new lambs followed their mothers close, bleating high and unsure. The world, in its slow way, was remembering how to live. Clara found herself remembering too. She began teaching the children from nearby homesteads, those whose families couldn't afford the trip to Red Willow's schoolhouse. They'd come by wagon, or sometimes barefoot across the field, their laughter breaking the quiet of the mornings. She taught them letters on a slate, her voice gentle but firm, her hands tracing shapes in chalk and air. "Hold the pencil steady," she'd say. "The words will come when they're ready." The porch filled with their laughter and the scuff of small boots. Elias pretended not to watch, though his work slowed every time the children came. He'd linger by the barn door, leaning against the post, hat pulled low. But now and then, Clara would catch him smiling quietly, like a man who had forgotten how. The children began calling her Miss Clara, though no one told them to. It spread through the valley faster than any rumor ever had, and when folks from town passed by, they tipped their hats again instead of whispering. The land, it seemed, had chosen its own kind of forgiveness. Each morning still began the same way. Clara would wake to the smell of coffee drifting under her door, always the same 1 cup, steaming, set just outside her room. It was his way, even now that they shared the same roof, a habit too deep to break, or maybe one he never meant to. She never mentioned it, just smiled, lifted the cup, and held it between her hands before the day began. There were moments, small ones, when she'd feel his eyes on her, like when she bent to gather the wash from the line, or when she hummed a tune from long ago while sweeping the porch. He'd look, then turn away, but the glance stayed warm in the air. At night, they ate together, simple meals, bread, beans, stew when the larder was kind. The lamplight painted the room gold, softening the lines on their faces. Sometimes they talked about the ranch, sometimes about nothing at all. The quiet between them had changed. It wasn't distance anymore, but rest. One evening, when the sky burned orange behind the hills, Clara found him fixing the latch on the barn door. The air smelled of hay and rain. "You work too much?" she said softly, stepping closer. He looked up, smiling faintly. A man's got to earn his keep. She crossed her arms, the way she did when she wasn't entirely serious. "You've already earned it." He didn't answer, just kept working, but his hands slowed. She watched him a moment longer, then reached out, brushing a bit of sawdust from his sleeve. The touch lingered longer than she meant it to. He met her eyes, and for a second, the distance between them vanished like breath on glass. The wind moved through the field, bending the grass in waves. Somewhere, a cow lowed in the distance. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "the children want to read their stories out loud. You should come listen." He hesitated. "They won't want me there." "They will," she said, smiling. "You're the hero in half of them." That earned a quiet laugh, rough and honest. He nodded, and the moment passed, soft as dusk. Later that night, Clara sat at the table, the lamp burning low. She traced the rim of her coffee cup, still half full, cooling by the minute. Across from her, Elias was patching a tear in his coat. The needle moved clumsily in his big hands, but the stitches were careful, deliberate. When he looked up, she said, "You never told me how you learned to sew?" He shrugged. "Didn't. Just watched my mother mend things when I was little. Remembered the pattern." She smiled. "You've got a steady hand." He met her gaze. "Only when it matters." The words lingered there, quiet and true. Outside, the night deepened. The stars came in slow, one by one, until the sky filled with the same light they had once prayed under when everything had burned. When they rose to close the house, Clara found herself pausing by the door. The cool air met her face, smelling of pine and sheep and the faint sweetness of clover. Behind her, Elias set the kettle on the stove for morning, the same way he did every night. "Good night, Elias," she said softly. He turned from the stove, his expression unreadable but warm. "Good night, Miss Clara." The old name caught between them, gentle as a shared secret. In the quiet that followed, she smiled to herself and stepped into her room. The boards creaked, the fire cracked, and the wind hummed through the valley like a song half remembered. When morning came, the light fell through the window, pale and gold. And outside her door, as always, a cup of coffee waited, steam rising in the chill air, the same simple kindness that had once begun everything. Two shadows moved across the porch that day, one broad, one slight, woven together by the sun and by the quiet, patient kind of love that doesn't announce itself, but simply stays. The plum tree behind the house had bloomed early that year. Its branches, dark and twisted from old storms, were now dressed in white petals trembling against the wind like the first soft breath of forgiveness. The ground beneath was pale with fallen blossoms, and the air smelled faintly of honey and ash, the way spring sometimes does when it remembers what it survived. Clara was hanging laundry on the line when she saw Elias walking up from the barn. His stride was slower these days, steady and deliberate, the way men walk when they've learned the weight of time. The sun caught the brim of his hat, and for a heartbeat she thought of that first day on the Red Willow platform, how the light had caught the dust then too, and how much had changed since. He stopped a few feet from her, something small wrapped in a cloth in his hand. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the blossoms between them. "You've been up early again," she said, folding a sheet across her arm. "Old habits," he replied. "The land doesn't wait for anyone." She smiled softly. "Neither do I." He chuckled under his breath, then went quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't heavy, just full, like a pause before music starts. "I made something," he said finally, and unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a small ring, rough, imperfect, but catching the light as if it held a memory inside it. Clara blinked, her hands still. "Elias." "What's that?" "Used to be part of a horseshoe," he said. "From the old gray mare we pulled out of the fire last summer. The metal was dark, shaped into a simple circle, smooth where his file had touched it. He held it out toward her, the way a man might hold something fragile. Not because it would break, but because it meant too much to. "I don't have gold," he said, voice low, "and I'm no preacher. But I thought maybe this'd do." She looked at him, unsure if she should laugh or cry. "Elias Boone," she whispered. "Are you asking me what I think you're asking?" He nodded, the faintest smile in his eyes. "I'm not asking because you need a roof, or because it'd make the neighbors quiet down. I'm asking because this place feels like home when you're in it. Because your voice is the only thing that makes these walls remember how to laugh. For a moment, the wind stilled. The sound of the creek below the hill filled the silence, soft and constant. Clara looked at the ring again. The iron wasn't smooth, and it bore tiny marks from his hands, evidence of a man who had built and mended his way through life. She thought of the nights he'd left coffee at her door, of the morning light spilling across his face as he worked the fields, of how loneliness had slowly learned to breathe in their presence. She held out her hand. Then yes, she said quietly, just if it's you. His thumb brushed her fingers as he slid the ring into place. It fit. Not perfectly, but well enough. Looks better than I hoped, he murmured. It looks like us, she said. He laughed then, a deep, rough sound that startled a few petals loose from the tree above. They fluttered down, landing in her hair and on his shoulders. One caught on the edge of his coat, and she reached to brush it away, her touch lingering a moment longer than it needed to. You know, she said, smiling, I never imagined I'd end up marrying a man who still leaves coffee outside my door, and I never imagined I'd find someone who'd stay long enough to drink it. Her laughter joined his, soft and easy, the kind of sound that made the world feel whole again. Later that afternoon, they sat beneath the plum tree, the air warm with sunlight and the scent of blooming branches. The children she taught had gone home hours ago, their slates still dusted with chalk, their laughter echoing faintly across the hills. Elias leaned back against the trunk, his hat tilted low. You ever think about leaving, he asked. She shook her head. Not anymore. He nodded, watching a petal drift down and land on her lap. Good. Why, she asked, teasing. Because I just finished fixing that gate, and I'd hate to have no one to walk through it. She rolled her eyes, but her smile stayed. They sat in companionable quiet, the kind that years of solitude make precious. Every now and then, the wind carried the distant cry of a hawk or the soft bleat of a lamb down in the meadow. The world seemed to exhale with them. When the light began to fade, Elias reached for her hand again, his thumb tracing the edge of the ring. You ever think, he said slowly, how strange it is, the way things turn out. A woman sent back for being too old, a man too stubborn to change. And somehow, here we are. Clara looked at him, eyes reflecting the dying light. Maybe that's what life is, she said. Just a long road full of people who almost gave up until someone didn't. He smiled, and the quiet that followed felt like a blessing. As dusk deepened, he rose to light the lantern by the porch. The glow spilled across the yard, soft and gold, catching the falling petals as they drifted through the air. Clara watched him from beneath the tree, her hands resting in her lap, her heart as calm as the earth around her. The ring on her finger gleamed faintly in the lantern light, not perfect, not polished, just honest. And when Elias came back, sitting beside her once more, the world seemed to fold into that small moment, the light, the scent of plum, the warmth of his shoulder against hers. No vows spoken, no promises carved in stone, just two people and the gentle truth of staying. The night settled around them, soft and alive. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the sound carried across the hills like an old song coming home. And in that quiet, beneath the tree that had once survived every storm, Elias reached over and brushed a petal from her hair. It fell to the ground between them, white against the dark earth. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to, because some love stories aren't meant to be loud. They're meant to be lived slowly, tenderly, like a prayer whispered into spring air that already knows the answer. The wind never really left the valley. It just changed its voice with the seasons soft in spring, patient in summer, and low and hollow come winter, under the old plum tree, the same one that had watched them through fire and rain. The ground was white again, not with ash this time, but with petals, drifting down like a quiet blessing. The years had gathered gently around the house, smoothing the sharp edges of what once hurt. The wedding had been small, just neighbors, friends, a preacher from town who came in on horseback with dust on his coat. Clara wore a dress she'd mended herself, the same one she'd worn the day she came to Red Willow. Elias stood tall beside her, the brim of his hat in his hands, his voice steady when he said her name. When he slipped the iron ring on her finger, she could feel the warmth of his palm through it, rough and sure. They said their vows beneath the plum blossoms, the air thick with scent and light. Someone strummed a guitar, someone else cried, and when it was done, they walked back to the little house, hand in hand, as though they had been walking that way all their lives. A year later, the cry of a baby filled that same house. They named her Grace. She had Elias's eyes, that calm gray that seemed to hold both storm and silence. Clara would hum to her while the morning light filtered through the window, and the house, once haunted by quiet, learned a new sound laughter. The neighbors came often now. Children still came to learn their letters. Women brought pies or stories. Men stopped by for a cup of coffee and stayed longer than they meant to. The world that once looked away now found warmth here, drawn to something it couldn't quite name. Elias still rose before dawn. He still left a cup of coffee by her door, though the room was theirs now, and she could see him from where she lay. Some habits aren't meant to fade. They're just small ways of saying love without needing the word. Sometimes, in the hush before sunrise, Clara would watch him through the window. The fields spread out before him, the sheep moving slow through the mist. His breath hung in the cold air, and for a moment she'd think how strange and sacred it was that all the hurt, all the leaving, had led here. There were hard days too, the kind that came with drought and sickness and time. But even then, there was something steady between them, like the sound of rain on the roof, reminding them that nothing beautiful ever came easy. Grace grew. She followed her father to the fields, her mother to the porch, her hair tangled with wind and laughter. Sometimes, at night, Clara would find her asleep near the hearth, her small fingers curled around one of Elias's work gloves. He'd smile when he saw it, lift her gently, and carry her to bed. The years moved quiet as dust. Seasons came and went without grand announcements. The house changed, not in walls or wood, but in what it held: echoes of voices, footsteps, the smell of bread baking, the sound of a man humming low to himself as he mended a fence outside. Every winter, when the first snow fell, Clara would light a fire in the hearth and think of the train station the day everything had almost gone another way. She would wonder sometimes what her life might have been if she'd stepped on that train. Then she'd hear Elias behind her, setting the kettle on, his boots leaving small marks on the floor, and she'd know. She hadn't stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She'd stayed because home had found her. One evening, long after the world had turned gold with autumn, she stood at the window while the wind chased leaves across the yard. Elias sat at the table, carving a toy horse for Grace. The lantern light caught the lines on his face, the quiet years written there in fine detail. She turned, watching him for a long moment. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think love was something that happened all at once, like lightning." He looked up, smiling faintly. "And now I think it's more like the wind." She glanced toward the window, where the curtain stirred gently. "You don't always see it, but you know it's there." He nodded, setting down the carving knife. "That sounds about right." Outside, the stars began to rise, slow and patient. The plum tree stood bare now, its branches black against the pale sky, waiting for another spring. The house creaked, the fire murmured, and from the next room came the soft breathing of a sleeping child. Elias reached across the table, his hand covering hers. She turned her palm upward, fingers fitting into his the way they always had. No words passed between them. They'd said all that needed saying years ago. The night deepened, a coyote called from far off, and the wind carried its echo down the valley. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked. He smiled into her hair. "Not anymore." She closed her eyes, the warmth of the fire brushing her skin, the rhythm of his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. And in that stillness, the years folded in on themselves: the station, the fire, the letters never sent, All of it, somehow, had led here. To this breath, this peace. The wind moved through the trees again, carrying the scent of distant rain. Clara's hand tightened around his. There was no lesson in it, no grand ending to speak of, just two people who had once been strangers, now sitting together in the quiet heart of a life they had built from ashes and grace. A life that didn't shout, didn't shine, but stayed. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. The world outside was all shadow and whisper. Elias leaned forward, blew out the flame, and the room fell softly into dark. For a moment, there was nothing, only the sound of wind, the pulse of warmth still rising from the hearth. And then, faintly, the echo of laughter, a child's. It drifted through the dark like a promise kept, and the valley, once lonely and hollow, breathed easy again. Some stories don't teach through words, but through quiet endurance. Clara and Elias remind us that love isn't always born in the blaze of youth. It can arrive softly, after years of silence and loss. They show that what's broken in us can still become beautiful when we choose patience, kindness, and the courage to stay. In a world that often rushes forward, their story whispers the truth that peace is not found in what we chase, but in what we nurture morning by morning, gesture by gesture. It reminds us that a life well lived doesn't depend on grand victories, but on small acts of care, a cup of coffee left at the door, a word unspoken yet deeply felt. For those who have known loneliness, age, or regret, Clara and Elias stand as proof that it's never too late to begin again. That love, like spring after a long winter, always finds its way back. And perhaps that's the real lesson: we don't heal by forgetting the past, but by learning to hold it gently and keep walking forward hand in hand into the quiet light of what remains. Thank you for sitting with us and listening to this story from the Old West. If it touched your heart even a little, please give us a like, share it with friends who love these quiet tales, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next journey into forgotten memories. Your support keeps these stories alive.